She built a life with the most dangerous man in New York, and he repaid her with a microphone, a crowd, and a single sentence that buried her alive. Roman Dragunov didn't just end a marriage tonight, he made the worst miscalculation of his criminal career, because the woman he humiliated in front of 500 witnesses wasn't just his wife. She was the granddaughter of a dynasty that could buy his entire empire before breakfast, and not one person in that ballroom knew it yet. Stay with me until the very end. Hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Yeet. The gown cost $14,000. Serafina Veil Dragunov knew this because she had watched Roman's personal assistant select it 3 weeks earlier. Ivory silk, seed pearl embroidery along the collar, a neckline designed to draw eyes without demanding them. The kind of dress that whispered old money while screaming nothing at all. Roman had approved it with a single glance and a short nod, the same way he approved catering menus and security rosters and monthly payments to city councilmen whose names he never bothered learning. She had worn it anyway. She told herself it was because the dress was beautiful. That was partially true. The fuller truth, the one she hadn't let herself examine directly in months, was that wearing what Roman chose felt safer than the alternative. Safer than the look he gave her when she wore something he hadn't seen first. Safer than the silence that followed. Long and pressurized. Like the moment before a car accident when your foot is already on the brake but physics has already decided what happens next. The Whitmore Grand Hotel's main ballroom held 512 people, according to the fire marshal's certificate mounted near the service entrance. Serafina had read it once while waiting for Roman to finish a conversation with a state senator. She read things like that now. Exit routes. Capacity numbers. The distance between where she was standing and the nearest door. That was what 5 years had done to her. The ballroom itself was a masterwork of conspicuous restraint. Cream-colored walls trimmed in brushed gold, chandeliers the size of small cars casting light that made every woman present look 10 years younger, and every man look more important than he was. The annual Dragunov Charitable Foundation Gala. Roman had founded it 7 years ago on the advice of his lawyer, who explained that legitimate philanthropy served as both tax architecture and social armor. Roman had listened, written the check, and then proceeded to run the foundation exactly as he ran everything else. As a projection of dominance dressed in expensive clothing, Serafina moved through the room the way she had learned to move through all of Roman's spaces, steadily, never too fast, never stopping long enough for anyone to trap her in conversation she couldn't exit cleanly. She carried a glass of sparkling water she had no intention of drinking and smiled at people whose names she sometimes couldn't remember, because there were always new names, always new faces cycling through Roman's orbit, and the ones who lasted were the ones she genuinely tried not to know too well. She spotted Selena Knox near the East Bar. Selena was wearing red, not the cautious, hedging red of women who weren't sure they could carry it, deep arterial red, structured at the shoulder, falling clean to the floor. She was laughing at something the city comptroller was saying, her hand resting briefly on his forearm in that way she had, that precise calibration of touch that communicated warmth while communicating access, while communicating I am someone you want to know better. Selena had been Roman's underboss for 4 years and his consigliere for 2. She was 38 years old, fluent in 4 languages, and possessed of a quality Serafina had spent considerable time trying to name accurately. The most honest word she'd landed on was hunger. Not the restless, undirected hunger of someone who simply wanted more. Something more specific, more tactical. The hunger of someone who had already identified exactly what they wanted and had been quietly, methodically clearing the path toward it for longer than anyone around them suspected. Serafina had known about the affair for 7 months. She had not confronted Roman. She understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent years reading a dangerous man's moods and silences, that confronting Roman without leverage was not a confrontation. It was a provocation with no exit. So she had said nothing. She had worn the ivory gown and attended the galas and smiled at the senators. And somewhere beneath all of that, beneath the learned stillness, the careful movements, the 5 years of accumulated small surrenders, something that had been quiet for a long time had been slowly, very slowly waking up. She didn't know yet what it was going to do when it fully opened its eyes. Roman found her near the string quartet. He was in a charcoal tuxedo, silver cufflinks, his dark hair swept back from a face that had been described in 3 separate magazine profiles as magnetic and in a sealed federal affidavit as predatory. Both were accurate. He was 51 years old and looked 43, the kind of man whose physical authority seemed to exist independently of his actual body. It preceded him into rooms and lingered after he left them. He had built his empire on that quality as much as on violence and money. "You look tired," he said, by way of greeting. "I'm fine," Serafina said. "Your posture." He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. "You're standing like someone who wants to leave." "I've been standing for 2 hours." He studied her for a moment with those flat gray eyes that never quite warmed, even when he smiled. Something moved behind them that she couldn't read, which was unusual. In 5 years, she had become fluent in Roman silences. This one had a texture she hadn't encountered before. "Stay visible tonight," he said. "I have an announcement." "What kind of announcement?" "The kind you'll hear when everyone else does." He walked away before she could respond. That, too, was usual. Roman Dragunov did not circle back. He issued and moved on, and the world rearranged itself accordingly, because that was what the world had been trained to do. Serafina watched him cross the room toward the elevated platform near the main stage, where a podium bearing the Foundation's crest waited beneath a pair of spotlights. She watched him stop beside Selena Knox, watched Selena's hand, not resting on a city official's arm now, press briefly against the small of Roman's back, there and gone in under a second, invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. Serafina was specifically looking for it. She set her water glass down on the nearest surface and breathed through her nose slowly, counting to 4 the way a therapist had taught her before she stopped going to therapy, because Roman had mentioned once, casually, that he didn't love the idea of her discussing their private life with someone whose confidentiality he couldn't personally verify. The room came to attention around 8:47. Roman didn't need a microphone for the first 15 seconds. His voice carried the way voices did when rooms had been trained to silence themselves at their owner's convenience. He thanked the guests. He acknowledged the senator who had co-chaired the fundraising committee. He mentioned numbers, donations collected, projects funded, communities served, and the room responded with the particular kind of applause that wealthy people produce when they want to signal approval without committing to genuine enthusiasm. Then the register of his voice shifted. It was subtle. If you hadn't spent 5 years calibrating yourself to the frequencies of Roman Dragunov's moods, you wouldn't have caught it. Serafina caught it. Something tightened at the base of her throat. 5 years ago, Roman said, I made a decision I believed was right. I brought someone into this empire, into this life, with the intention of building something together. The room had gone fully quiet now. Not the practiced quiet of polite attention, the held breath quiet of people sensing that something unrehearsed was happening. Serafina didn't move. I was wrong, Roman continued, not about what I built, about who I chose to build it with. She heard her own heartbeat. It was very loud, very slow. Serafina. He didn't look at her. He looked at the room, which was somehow worse. Our marriage is over, has been over in every way that matters, for some time now. Tonight, I'm simply making that fact official. The silence lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then it detonated. Not loudly. The people in that room were too practiced at performance to produce anything as artless as chaos. It was the sound of 500 conversations erupting simultaneously at the volume of whispers, which collectively produced something like a roar. And in the center of it, Serafina stood in her $14,000 ivory gown and felt the floor do nothing to use. Felt it remain exactly as solid and indifferent as floors always are when the world rearranges itself catastrophically around you. Roman stepped back from the podium. Selena Knox stepped up beside him. He took her hand. He kissed her. Right there. Right then. Under the chandeliers in front of the senator and the comptroller and the catering staff and the photographers whose cameras she registered distantly were already firing. Serafina's water glass was still sitting on the table behind her. She could feel the exact location of it. She did not turn around. She did not reach for it. She stood where she was and kept her face very still, not because she felt nothing, but because the magnitude of what she was feeling was so large and so varied and so fast that her body had made the executive decision to feel none of it until she was somewhere that wasn't here. Two of Roman's security men appeared at her left. She recognized the taller one, Victor, who had driven her to a gallery opening 2 weeks ago and told her about his daughter's school play with genuine, uncomplicated pride. "Mr. Dragunov has asked that you be escorted to the lobby," Victor said. He had the grace to look at the floor. "I know the way," Serafina said. "Ma'am." "I know," she said again, quietly. "The way." She walked. She kept her shoulders back and her pace measured, and she did not look at the people turning to watch her pass, because looking at them would have required acknowledging that she was the spectacle, and she was not ready to do that yet, was not ready to absorb the precise dimensions of what Roman had just done in front of everyone who mattered in this city. The lobby was marble and gold leaf and enormous floral arrangements that smelled like lilies and money. Victor and his partner stopped at the door. They had their instructions. Their instructions ended at the lobby threshold. The doorman held the exterior door. She walked through it. Manhattan's November air hit her like a flat hand, cold and immediate, stripping the ballroom warmth off her bare arms in under a second. The dress was silk. Silk was worthless against 41 degrees and a wind that came off the Hudson carrying no interest whatsoever in her situation. She stood on the sidewalk outside the Whitmore Grand and looked at the street. She had no coat. Roman's driver had her coat. Roman's driver, she realized, was no longer her driver, had ceased to be at some point during the past 40 minutes, while she was holding a glass of water and listening to the string quartet and watching Selena Knox's hand on Roman's back. She reached for her phone and opened her banking application. The screen loaded, displayed a balance. She looked at it for a long moment. Zero. Not the momentary zero of a processing delay. The specific administrative zero of accounts that have been suspended from the outside, cleanly and deliberately, in the way that only happens when someone with the appropriate authorizations made the appropriate calls at the appropriate time. He had planned this. Not just the announcement, not just the scene, the whole sequence, the gala, the microphone, the cameras, the frozen accounts, the coat in the car that was no longer her car. He had planned all of it. She thought about the way he'd looked at her by the string quartet, that unreadable texture in his silence. She understood it now. It was the expression of a man who had already executed a plan and was simply waiting for the appropriate moment to activate the next phase. A cab slowed at the curb. She let it pass. She had no money. She had no coat. She had $14,000 of ivory silk doing nothing for her in 41-degree wind, and a phone with full battery and a banking application displaying zero. She thought about the people she could call. The list was shorter than it should have been after 5 years of living in a city. That was the other thing 5 years had done to her. Roman hadn't forbidden friendships, not explicitly. He'd simply made the maintenance of them complicated in ways that accumulated. The last-minute schedule changes, the preference for private dinners over social gatherings, the mild but consistent curiosity whenever she mentioned spending time with someone he didn't know. And eventually, gradually, the way water finds the path of least resistance, her world had contracted to the dimensions of his. She scrolled to the contact. The name at the very top of her recent calls was Victor's, driver, now apparently former driver, and she kept scrolling until she reached the one she was looking for. She had called this number 4 times in 5 years. 3 of those had been on birthdays. It rang twice. Serafina. Her grandmother's voice was exactly as she remembered it. Not warm, precisely. Octavia Vale had never been warm in the soft, yielding sense of the word, but present, absolutely and entirely present, in the way of people who have spent decades making decisions that moved money and ships and political outcomes, and who understood that the quality of attention you brought to a moment determined whether you controlled it or it controlled you. "Grandmother, you sound cold. I'm outside. The Whitmore Grand." A pause. Brief. 2 seconds at most. "Tell me what happened," Serafina told her. She kept it precise and in order. The announcement, the kiss, Mia's, Victor at her elbow, the lobby, the banking application. She stood on the sidewalk with the wind coming off the Hudson, and she told her grandmother every relevant fact without editorializing, without crying, because crying was something she was saving for a room with a locked door. When she finished, the silence on the line lasted exactly long enough for Octavia Vale to complete a calculation that most people would have needed a week to run. "Who declared war on our family?" The question landed on Serafina like cold water. Not the unpleasant kind, the kind that wakes something up, that snaps a current of clarity through confusion and shock, and the slow-burning humiliation of a ballroom full of witnesses. She understood in that moment what her grandmother was doing. Octavia Vale was not asking who had hurt her granddaughter. She was reframing what had just happened from the inside out, pulling it from the category of personal wound and placing it exactly where it belonged. Not an ending, a beginning, not a defeat, an opening move in something that had just been declared. Serafina felt the cold on her arms, felt the silk doing nothing, felt the weight of the phone against her ear and the emptiness of a banking application and the precise, pressurized shame of walking out of a ballroom because 2 security men had been sent to escort her. She felt all of it. Then she said, very quietly, "Roman Dragunov." "Stay where you are," Octavia said. "A car will be there in 12 minutes. The line went quiet. Not disconnected. Her grandmother didn't say goodbye, never had, because goodbye implied a finality that Octavia Vale considered premature in almost every situation she had ever encountered. Serafina lowered the phone. The wind moved through her hair. A cab passed, then a delivery truck, then nothing for a few seconds, just the ambient percussion of Manhattan at night. Sirens somewhere north, a horn somewhere east, the specific quality of city silence that is never actually silent. She stood in her ivory dress on the sidewalk, and she let herself, for exactly 90 seconds, feel the full weight of everything Roman Dragunov had just done to her. The public dismantling, the deliberate choreography of humiliation, because that's what it was. She could see the architecture of it now, could see how each element was placed for maximum visibility and minimum deniability. The cameras, the kiss, Victor at her elbow with his eyes on the floor, the 0 in the banking application. All of it designed not just to end a marriage, but to end her, specifically. To excise her from the organism of his empire so completely and so publicly that no one in that room would even think to ask whether she had somewhere to go. He had wanted her to have nowhere to go. That was the detail that burned, not the affair, not even the announcement. The calculation behind all of it, the specific cruelty of a man who had spent 5 years watching her world contract around him and had filed that information away and used it tonight as a weapon. 90 seconds. She let herself feel it for 90 seconds. Then she stopped. Because the car Octavia Vale sent was going to arrive in approximately 10 minutes, and when it did, Serafina was going to get inside it, and whatever came next was going to require her to be something other than a woman standing in the cold outside a ballroom that had just watched her husband kiss someone else under the chandeliers. She straightened her shoulders. She thought about the question her grandmother had asked, the specific framing of it. Who declared war? Not what happened, not what did he do, not are you all right. Who declared war? Because Roman Dragunov had stood in front of 500 witnesses tonight and made a move. He had made it publicly and deliberately and with the full weight of his empire behind him, and he believed, he genuinely, completely believed, that what he had thrown away was a liability. Dead weight. His word for her apparently was dead weight, and it would probably be in at least 3 newspapers by morning. He had no idea what he had actually thrown away. That realization arrived slowly, like heat returning to cold hands. Her grandmother's voice, the car already in motion somewhere across the city. 12 minutes, Octavia had said, with the calm certainty of someone who always knew exactly how long things took because they had arranged them in advance, as if she had been waiting for this call, as if she had been prepared for it. Serafina turned that thought over, set it aside. She would examine it later when she was warm and alone and had access to something stronger than sparkling water. The black car arrived in 11 minutes, not 12, a detail that, under other circumstances, she might not have noticed. She noticed it now. She noticed everything now, with the sharpened, uncomfortably precise attention of someone whose safety architecture had just been demolished, and who understood that from this point forward, everything she had been permitted to not pay attention to was going to require paying attention to. The driver did not speak. The car was warm. There was a cashmere blanket on the back seat that had been placed there deliberately, she understood, not left over from a previous passenger, but placed, positioned, anticipated. She wrapped it around her shoulders. Outside the window, Manhattan moved past. The lights, the people, the geometry of a city that had spent 5 years being Roman Dragunov's city, and had now, in the span of a single evening, become something else entirely. She didn't know yet what it was going to become. She didn't know yet what she was going to become inside it. But she knew this. The woman who had walked out of that ballroom in ivory silk and said nothing, who had let Victor guide her to the lobby with his eyes on the floor, that woman was finishing the last minutes of her existence on the back seat of this car, wrapped in cashmere, watching Manhattan slide past the window. Whatever came through the Vale family's door was going to be someone different. The car turned north, and in a glass penthouse 17 floors above Midtown, Roman Dragunov stood beside Selena Knox, accepting congratulations from the senator and the comptroller and the catering staff and photographers whose cameras had captured exactly the images he intended them to capture, and he felt, for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, entirely free. He had no idea that in 11 minutes, before his driver had even brought the second round of drinks, his grandmother-in-law's personal attorney would have already begun placing the first of 7 phone calls that would, within 48 hours, cause the ground beneath his empire to begin to crack. The Vale family's Manhattan residence was not what most people imagined when they thought of old European money. There was no excessive ornamentation, no gilded ceilings or aggressive displays of inherited wealth. The townhouse on East 74th Street was 4 stories of dark limestone and original ironwork, interior rooms that smelled like old paper and wool, and something underneath both of those that Serafina had never been able to name accurately, but had always associated with the specific quality of safety that came not from softness, but from permanence. The kind of safety that didn't promise nothing bad would happen. The kind that promised that whatever happened, the structure around you would still be standing when it was over. She had not been inside this building in 3 years. The housekeeper, an older woman named Cora, who had worked for Octavia Vale for longer than Serafina had been alive, opened the door before the car had fully stopped. That too was deliberate. That too had been arranged. Serafina walked in still wearing the ivory gown. The cashmere blanket was still around her shoulders. She had not cried in the car. She was beginning to suspect she was not going to cry at all tonight, which was either a sign of considerable psychological resilience or a sign of something she'd have to examine more carefully later. Cora took her through the entrance hall without speaking and brought her to the second-floor sitting room where a fire had been lit. Not recently, she noticed, not in the last 30 minutes, but some time ago. Built up to a steady producing heat that indicated whoever had started it had anticipated a long evening. Octavia Vale was already there. She was 76 years old and looked in the way of certain women who have spent their entire lives in absolute command of every room they entered, ageless in a way that had nothing to do with cosmetic intervention and everything to do with bearing. She was seated in a wingback chair near the fireplace, dressed in charcoal gray, her silver hair pinned exactly as it always was. And she was reading something on a tablet with the focused attention she brought to everything, which was to say, total. She looked up when Serafina entered and did not say anything immediately. She looked at the ivory gown. She looked at the cashmere blanket. She looked at Serafina's face with the particular quality of attention that stripped pretense efficiently and without cruelty. Then she set the tablet down and said, "Sit." Serafina sat. Cora appeared with tea that neither of them had asked for and disappeared again. The fire made its sounds. Outside, Manhattan continued its indifferent percussion. "He planned it," Serafina said. "The accounts were frozen before the announcement. He had it sequenced." "Yes," Octavia said. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not." Serafina absorbed that. "How long have you known something was coming?" Octavia picked up her tea, set it down without drinking. Roman Dragunov has been moving money in patterns inconsistent with his stated expansion plan for approximately 4 months. Our financial intelligence team flagged it at month 2. At month 3, I had your brother Dorian begin a quiet review of every institution with exposure to his organization. The fire, the wool smell, the sound of Serafina's own breathing. "You were already watching him," she said. "We are always watching," Octavia said simply, without apology. "You were part of his empire. That made him relevant to us whether you chose to exercise your family standing or not. I chose not to exercise it for 5 years. Yes." A pause, precise and weighted. "You did." That landed where it was intended to land, not as a wound, as a fact, offered plainly, because Octavia Vale did not traffic in euphemism when plain truth was more useful. Serafina thought about the last 5 years, thought about what she had traded, gradually and then all at once, for the idea of a life built inside Roman's orbit. She thought about what she had told herself the trades were worth. The warmth was supposed to be there. The partnership was supposed to be there. She had believed, with the earnest and slightly willful belief of someone who very much wanted a particular thing to be true, that she had found both. "I want to know everything," she said. "Everything your team found. In the morning, tonight I need to know what we're working with," Serafina said. The word we came out clean and immediate, without premeditation, and she heard it land and didn't take it back. Octavia looked at her for a long moment. "All right," she said. "In the morning." The bedroom they put her in was the same one she'd used as a child during visits from overseas. The sheets were the same thread count. The window faced the same courtyard. She lay on top of the covers in the ivory gown because undressing felt like a more significant act than she was ready to perform, and stared at the ceiling for approximately 40 minutes before her body made the decision for her, and she slept without dreaming, which was unusual, and which she took as evidence that she was more exhausted than she had realized. She woke at 5:43 to the sound of voices below. She recognized both. She washed her face, borrowed a plain gray shirt and trousers from the closet where Cora apparently maintained guest clothing with unsettling forethought, and went downstairs. Cassian Vale was in the dining room. He was 42, 11 years her senior, and had their grandmother's quality of absolute stillness in contained spaces. He was standing at the sideboard with a coffee cup, dressed like someone who had arrived directly from a meeting that had started the night before, which was probably accurate. He was the family's financial architect, the one who built the structures that Octavia designed and Dorian operated, the one who understood the internal load-bearing mechanics of every institution with a Vale fingerprint on it. He looked at her when she entered. His expression did something brief and complicated. "You look terrible, Sick," he said. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." He poured her coffee without asking. "I've been on calls since 11. Serafina took the coffee. "What kind of calls?" "The kind where you quietly inform 12 separate institutions that a certain client's credit review has been accelerated." He sat down. "Drink that. We have a lot to cover." Dorian arrived 20 minutes later. He was 37, the youngest, and had always been the one most visibly comfortable with confrontation. Not because he sought it, but because he moved through it with an efficiency that made it appear routine. He dropped a leather portfolio on the table and sat without greeting anyone, which was his version of warmth. "He's already doing damage control," Dorian said. PR team put out a statement at 2 a.m. framing the announcement as a mutual and amicable decision. 3 outlets ran it unchecked. "Of course they did," Cassian said. "He has 2 editors in his pocket and a stake in a media holding company." "Past tense," Dorian said. He flipped open the portfolio. "The media holding company's lead investor pulled their stake this morning at 6 a.m., per our instruction." Serafina looked in the papers. Numbers mostly. Institutional names she recognized some of, and others she didn't. "He won't understand what's happening yet," she said. "Probably not for another 24 hours, Cassian agreed. "The early signals will look like coincidence. A delayed transaction here, a suspended account review there. By the time the pattern becomes visible to him, the architecture will already be too far along to reverse. He'll trace it back to us." "Eventually," Octavia said from the doorway. None of them had heard her come downstairs. She moved through rooms with the quiet authority of someone who considered making noise a form of imprecision. She was dressed, already, in the same charcoal gray, and she carried nothing. No tablet, no papers, no phone. She held information in her head the way other people held car keys. She sat at the head of the table. The room reoriented itself toward her without anyone visibly doing anything. "When he traces it back to us," she continued, "we want him to. That is the point. Roman Dragunov's greatest vulnerability is his certainty that fear is the universal solvent. He believes that when he identifies who is pressuring him, the act of identification will give him leverage. He expects that when he turns to face us, we will negotiate." She folded her hands on the table. "He is going to be wrong about that." Serafina looked at her grandmother. "What do we do between now and when he figures it out?" "We work," Octavia said simply. Roman Dragunov woke at 7:15 to the sound of 3 phones ringing. He had slept exceptionally well. He had eaten a room service breakfast that cost $400 and justified it as celebration. He had sent Selena home at 2 a.m. because he had never been someone who let sentiment soften logistics, and there was still a great deal of logistics to manage in the wake of last night. He answered the first call. It was his financial director, a man named Greaves, who had been with him for 9 years and who operated with a specific, calibrated anxiety that Roman had come to read as reliable rather than irritating. When Greaves was anxious, something was real. Greaves was very anxious. A transaction that should have cleared overnight didn't, Greaves said. Rotterdam Port Authority, the payment for the Q4 berth reservations. The wire shows as sent on our end, but the receiving institution says it never arrived. Pull it and resend, Roman said. I tried. The correspondent bank flagged our account for a review. A pause. That bank is one of 3 that manage our European clearing. If they've flagged the account, find out who ordered the flag and call me back. He hung up and answered the second call. This one was from a man named Price, who coordinated his private security contracts with 3 separate firms. 2 of those firms had contacted Price in the early morning hours to inform him that effective immediately, they were suspending their agreements with Dragunov-affiliated entities pending a review of certain contractual terms. Both firms in the same night. Roman turned that over. The third call was from his lawyer. One of the offshore structures we used for the Luxembourg deal is showing irregular activity. I'm going to need— Come to the office, Roman said. Bring Selena. He stood at the window of the penthouse and looked at Manhattan below. The city had the early morning quality of something not yet fully committed to the day, light, thin, and gray, the streets below moving with the mechanical purposefulness of commuters. He felt, under the habitual certainty, a very small and very cold thing. He ignored it. By 10:30, Selena Knox was in his office on the 44th floor of Dragunov Tower, and the picture assembling itself across the various reports and calls and flagged accounts was beginning to have a shape. It was not a comfortable shape. 3 banks, she said, standing over the document spread across the conference table. She had come in tight and controlled, the way she always was in operational contexts, and he had found that attractive once, that quality of compression, the way she seemed to occupy exactly the space required, and no more. He noticed now that she was reading the documents faster than she was acknowledging what she was reading, which meant she was managing her own reaction to what she saw. 3 banks in 24 hours, he said. 2 security firms, 4 shipping brokers. The Rotterdam situation. And the Luxembourg structure. And Luxembourg. He sat on the edge of the desk. What's the connection? I'm working on it. Selena. She looked up. What's the connection? He said again. The second time was quieter. That was how Roman communicated escalation. Not louder, but quieter, slower, more deliberate, the voice dropping to the register where it became something more like the memory of a threat than the thing itself. She held his gaze. The banks that flagged us. One of them has a majority stake held by a Cayman-registered holding company. The holding company's parent entity is listed as Viridian Capital Partners. She paused. Viridian is a Vail subsidiary. The room went very quiet. Roman's face did nothing. That was the skill, the deliberate maintenance of stillness across the surface while something moved fast and cold underneath it. The Vails, he said. One data point. I need more time to verify how many of our institutions have Vail exposure? Another pause. The wrong kind. The kind where someone has information they have been performing uncertainty about. Selena. At initial count, she said carefully, 11, possibly more. He stood up from the desk. He walked to the window. He stood there for a period of time that was hard to measure because it had the quality of suspension, like the moment between a thing happening and the world registering that it had happened. She called the grandmother, he said. That would be the logical— Last night, she called Octavia Vail last night, and I underestimated what that meant. He turned from the window. His voice was completely level. I knew she was a Vail. Everyone knows the family. But she walked away from them. She chose me over that name. I assumed— You assumed she stayed, walked away, Selena said. He looked at her. She had the quality, in that moment, of someone who has just said something true that they immediately wish they hadn't. Get me everything you have on Vail Dynasty Financial Holdings in the next 2 hours, he said. Everything. Every subsidiary, every partner institution, every fund with a Vail trustee. Roman. 2 hours. She left. Roman turned back to the window. Below, Manhattan moved. Above, in his reflection in the glass, a man stood with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set, and his eyes doing the thing they did when he had made a calculation error that could not be unmade. He had calculated last night that Serafina Vail was a woman with no money, no connections she had maintained, and no appetite for confrontation. 5 years of watching her not exercise any of the qualities that would have made her dangerous had convinced him that those qualities were absent. He had been wrong before. Not often, but he had been wrong before. He picked up his phone and called a man named Torrance, who handled the lateral communications between his organization and 3 allied Mafia families. He told Torrance he needed a meeting. Today. Torrance said he would make calls. Roman said that was good. He stood at the window for another minute after the call ended, and the small cold thing that he had ignored at 7:15 was slightly less small now and slightly less ignorable. And for the first time since he had stood at that podium and felt entirely free, Roman Dragunov understood that the next 72 hours were going to require the full weight of everything he had ever built. On East 74th Street, Cassian Vail looked up from his laptop at 3:17 in the afternoon and said, "He's moving. Contacted the Torrance network. He's calling a family meeting." Serafina was at the other end of the table with a yellow legal pad covered in her own handwriting. She had been at this table since 8 in the morning and had consumed 3 cups of coffee and 1 meal that Cora had placed in front of her with the quiet insistence of someone who understood that thinking required fuel. "How do we know about Torrance?" she asked. Cassian looked at her with a brief expression that said the answer was obvious, and also that he had decided not to be condescending about it being obvious. "We have had a relationship with the Torrance network for 8 years. They communicate with us about material developments in exchange for certain financial considerations. You own an informant inside his alliance network. We maintain a relationship," Cassian said, "with someone who values the stability of multiple revenue streams." Dorian, who was on a phone call near the window, held up 2 fingers without turning around. The signal for 2 minutes. When he hung up, he turned and said, "Price just called 3 former security contractors about emergency rehiring. All 3 referred him back to their current exclusive agreement with Vail-affiliated entities." Serafina put her pen down. "He can't replace the security firms." "He can try. The options available to him at this speed and scale are limited." Dorian sat back down. He's feeling the edges of the box. "He doesn't know it's a box yet," Cassian said. "He will by tomorrow morning." Serafina picked her pen back up. She looked at the legal pad. Then she looked at her brothers, Cassian with his contained architectural calm, Dorian with his matter-of-fact efficiency. And she thought about the 5 years she had spent at the contracted perimeter of Roman's world, watching it function, watching the machinery of power and fear and obligation move in its cycles, believing she was adjacent to it and not understanding until last night that she had been, all along, adjacent to something considerably larger. "I want to be in the room," she said, "when we move publicly. I don't want to be the name on the documents. I want to be present." Cassian looked at Octavia, who had said nothing for the last 20 minutes, and had been sitting with a stillness so complete she might have been carved. Octavia said, "Yes." One word, no elaboration, as if the question had always had only one answer, and the time spent arriving at it had simply been necessary processing. At 4:45, Roman's 3 allied family heads declined the emergency meeting. Torrance delivered the information with the specific flatness of a man communicating something he did not want to be associated with. All 3 families, the Marchetti Network, the Voss Organization, the Belmont Group, had cited scheduling conflicts, all 3 on the same afternoon, within 2 hours of each other. Roman stood in his office and looked at the 3 declined confirmations on Torrance's message, and understood, with the abrupt, almost physical clarity of a man who has built an empire on reading power correctly and who is now having to apply that skill to his own situation, that the calls had been coordinated. Someone had reached the family heads before Torrance did. "Who called them?" he said. "I'm working on—" "Who called them first, Torrance?" "I don't have—" Roman ended the call. He picked up the bourbon on his desk, looked at it, put it back down. He had a rule about drinking before dark in operational contexts. He maintained the rule. Selena appeared in the office doorway at 5:15. She had the look of someone who had been running calculations for 6 hours and had arrived at a number they genuinely wished they hadn't. "I have the full exposure count," she said. He waited. "Across primary institutions, subsidiary lenders, offshore structures, and partner entities," she said, "we have veil traceable exposure in approximately 63% of our active financial channels." He heard the number. He sat down. She continued because she was Selena Knox, and she had never once in her professional life failed to complete a report, regardless of whether the recipient wanted to hear it. The positioning of the holdings wasn't random, and it wasn't recent. Several of these stakes go back 4 and 5 years. They were assembled over time through shell entities, through nominee holders. Whoever built this structure was building it for exactly this moment. Roman looked at the desk surface. There was a pen there, a water glass, the bourbon he hadn't opened. These were objects in a room that was still his, in a building that still bore his name, and none of that had changed in the last 60 seconds, and all of it felt profoundly different. "They were already inside," he said. "Yes. Before the marriage. Some of it. The deeper positions appear to have been added incrementally across the 5 years of the marriage. But the initial architecture," she stopped. "Yes. Some of it was in place before." He looked at her. She looked back. There was a thing she wasn't saying. He could see it in the specific quality of her stillness, the way she was holding her expression carefully in place like someone maintaining form at significant muscular cost. "Say it," he said. "They may have known this was a possibility from the beginning," Selena said. "The Vale family. They may have known she was walking into a volatile situation, and they built the infrastructure to respond to exactly what happened, which means Serafina didn't plan this. She couldn't have. She didn't know about the holdings, but her grandmother did." A pause. "Octavia Vale built a cage around your empire 5 years ago, and she has been waiting very patiently for you to give her reason to use it." The room had no new sounds. The city outside continued. The bourbon stayed where it was. Roman Dragunov sat in his office on the 44th floor of a building with his name on it, and understood, for the first time in his adult life, that he had been living inside someone else's contingency plan. His phone buzzed. A message from Greaves. "Rotterdam just rejected the resent wire. Account flagged across the correspondent network. Full suspension pending review." He put the phone face down on the desk. "Tomorrow morning," he said to Selena, "I want every lawyer we have in this office at 7 a.m. And get me a line to Hargrove at the SEC. I want to know exactly what legal avenues—" His office phone rang. He looked at it. The internal line, the one reserved for the building's front security desk. He picked up. "What, sir?" The security guard's voice had the particular flatness of someone delivering information they had been specifically instructed to deliver exactly as given. "There's a message for you from a Ms. Octavia Vale. She says she would like to invite you to observe a press conference that will be held tomorrow afternoon at the Hartwell Center. She says you will want to be present." Roman didn't speak for a moment. "She says," the guard continued, reading clearly from something written, and I'm quoting here, sir, "The matter of the Vale family's response to last evening's events will be made public at 2 p.m. You are welcome to observe. You will not be welcome to speak." The line waited. Roman said very quietly, "Tell her I received the message." He hung up. He sat in his office for a long time after that, and the thing that had been small and cold at 7:15 in the morning was no longer small, and Roman Dragunov, who had not been genuinely afraid of anything in over 20 years, sat with that fact and could not put it back where it had been, because some things, once they have fully arrived, do not go back. The morning of the press conference arrived the way bad days often did. Not dramatically, but with a flat gray efficiency, the sky over Manhattan the color of old concrete, the kind of light that made everything look slightly less resolved than it actually was. Serafina was awake at 4:30. She had slept 3 hours. She knew because she had watched the clock at 1:17 and again at 4:31, and the math between those two numbers was the entirety of what her body had managed. She lay in the dark of the East 74th Street bedroom and ran through the sequence of the day ahead, the way she had run through it 4 times already since midnight, checking for gaps, for the things that could go wrong in the specific way that Octavia Vale had trained her, in the compressed 12 hours since her return, to think about all contingencies as load-bearing rather than peripheral. At 5:15, she gave up on the pretense of more sleep and went downstairs. Cassian was already at the dining room table. He had a laptop open and a phone at his ear, and a coffee that appeared to have been there long enough to go cold, which he hadn't noticed. He held up one finger without looking at her. She poured coffee and waited. He finished the call. Zurich confirmed. The escrow transfer for the Hartwell Center presentation materials cleared at 4 a.m. Dorian's team is already setting up. How many media confirmed? 41 outlets, print, broadcast, digital. We had requests from 6 international wire services. He closed the laptop. Whatever Roman expected when he accepted the invitation, it wasn't 41 media outlets. He didn't accept. He received the message. Same outcome. Cassian studied her. How are you holding? I'm fine. Sarah. I'm functional, she said. That's what matters today. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of an older brother who has calculated that pressing further will produce diminishing returns. He let it go. Octavia came down at 6 precisely, dressed in midnight blue, her posture so perfectly maintained it looked structural rather than cultivated. She sat, accepted coffee from Cora, looked at the briefing documents Cassian had laid out and said, Dorian called 20 minutes ago. There's a development. Cassian looked up. What kind? The kind we'll discuss when he arrives. She folded her hands. Eat something, Serafina. You're going to need your body functional for longer than you think today. Serafina ate toast she didn't taste. Dorian arrived at 6:48. He came through the front door with the energy of someone who had been moving fast for a long time and had not yet decided whether to slow down, and he dropped into a chair and put both hands flat on the table and said, without preamble, we have a problem. The room waited. One of the financial documents we plan to present at 2 o'clock, the forensic audit trail showing Roman's money laundering pipeline through the Cayman structures, has a gap. He looked at Cassian. A deliberate gap. Someone pulled a sequence of 3 transaction records from the digital archive at 2:17 this morning. Silence. Internal access? Cassian said. Has to be. The archive isn't externally accessible. Whoever pulled those records had credentials. Serafina set down her coffee cup. The sound was very small in the room. Which records? The 3 that linked the Meridian Fund directly to Roman's domestic political contribution network. Without those, the audit trail still shows money laundering, but it doesn't show the political corruption layer. It's still damaging, but it's not the thing that makes cooperation from federal investigators automatic, Octavia said. No, Dorian said, it's not. Another silence, longer than the first. Who has archive credentials? Serafina said. Cassian and Dorian exchanged a look. Brief, fractional. The kind of look that people produce when they have already had a version of this conversation and are now having it again in a room with an additional person. Cassian, Serafina said. Who has credentials? 4 people, Cassian said. Myself, Dorian, our head of forensic accounting, Marcus Veld, and our legal director, Petra Hale. And one other, whose access was granted at grandmother's direction approximately 5 years ago and was never revoked because... He stopped. Because I was still technically a Vale family principal, Serafina said. Yes. She heard it, sat with it. So the access trail leads to me. The access trail shows my credentials, she said, my login, my archive access. She was very still. Roman's people found a way to access the archive under my credentials and pulled the documents. That's the most likely explanation, Dorian said. Or, Cassian said carefully, the access log is being constructed to appear that way. There are 2 possibilities. Someone inside our operation with those credentials accessed the archive, or someone externally found a way to authenticate as you specifically. Both scenarios have the same result, Serafina said. The documents are gone, and if anyone pulls the access log, my name is on the deletion. Yes. She stood up. She walked to the window. Outside, the gray light was starting to thin towards something pale and unconvincing that might eventually become morning. She looked at the courtyard below, the iron furniture, the old stone, the specific texture of a place that had always represented something she had trusted completely. Does Roman know about the archive? She said. He shouldn't, Dorian said. The archive's existence is internal. But if Selena Knox spent 12 years building a profile of Vale Financial Operations as Roman's consigliere, she would have known. Serafina turned from the window. She was in the room with me. Multiple times. Over 5 years she attended functions, dinners. I mentioned the family's documentation practices twice in her presence. I remember both occasions. She paused. I didn't think she was listening. She was always listening, Octavia said. The words landed flat and factual. No comfort embedded in them. No cruelty either. Just the plain truth of what Selena Knox had been, in proximity to Serafina, for 5 years, and what that proximity had produced. Serafina felt something move through her chest. Not grief, not quite anger, but the specific and somewhat airless sensation of understanding something you had refused to look at directly, and that now, fully seen, could not be unseen. We proceed, she said. Cassian looked at her. The political corruption layer. We proceed without it. We have the laundering evidence, the fraudulent property acquisitions, the offshore structures, the institutional manipulation. It's not everything we planned, but it's still... She stopped, rerouted. What time is the earliest we can get federal contacts in a room? I can have someone at Justice on the phone by 8, Dorian said. Do it. Tell them we have a presentation today at 2 o'clock with supporting documentation on organized financial crime at significant institutional scale, and that we will be making a voluntary submission of evidence. That gives them reason to have people in the room before we go public. And the missing records, Cassian said. I'll get them back, she said. Everyone looked at her. I know where Selena keeps her backup systems, Serafina said. She kept a personal server at the apartment on West 58th. She mentioned it once. She said it was a security habit. Everything that mattered, she kept a personal copy. She thought it made her indispensable. It might have made her a liability instead, Dorian said. Yes, Serafina said. That's the idea. Roman Dragunov arrived at Dragunov Tower at 7 a.m. to find 4 of his 6 senior lawyers already in the conference room and Greaves standing outside his office door with the expression of a man who has been holding information he doesn't want to deliver and has run out of time to keep holding it. Rotterdam, Roman said. Rotterdam, Hamburg, and now Marseille, Greaves said. All 3 port authorities have received notification from their primary bank partners that Dragunov-affiliated accounts are under enhanced review. None of the berth reservations for Q1 can be confirmed until the review's complete. Roman walked past him into the office. How long do enhanced reviews take? Typically 30 to 90 days. We have cargo scheduled for... I know what we have scheduled, Greaves said. He had stopped following Roman into the office and was standing in the doorway, which was unusual, which registered. Roman, if the 3 ports act in concert and maintain the holds for 30 days, we lose approximately $400 million in contracted cargo revenue. If it extends to 60, it won't extend to 60 days. If it does, Greaves said, and his voice had changed slightly, had acquired the quality of someone who had made a decision about something in the last hour and was committed to it, we won't be able to service the Meridian Fund repayment schedule that comes due in March. Roman turned around. Greaves was still in the doorway. His face was doing something that Roman, in 9 years, had not seen it do. Something that looked, with uncomfortable specificity, like the face of a man who was calculating distance between himself and the nearest exit. Sit down, Greaves, Roman said. I need to... Sit down. Greaves sat down. Roman looked at him. He had the quality, in these moments, of absolute compression. Everything that was dangerous about him pulled inward rather than projected outward, and that inward pull had a gravity that most people in his proximity found very difficult to resist. Tell me what you know, Roman said. All of it. Not the portfolio version, the real version, Greaves told him. It took 9 minutes. Roman did not interrupt. He sat behind his desk and listened to Greaves describe the full scope of what he had assembled over the prior 18 hours. The Vale fingerprints across 63% of their active financial infrastructure. The coordinated nature of the port suspensions, the security firm terminations, the 3 Mafia family heads who had declined the meeting within 2 hours of each other, the access pattern in their own internal systems that suggested someone had been mapping their transaction architecture in preparation for exactly this kind of coordinated pressure. 9 minutes. When Greaves finished, Roman said, "Why didn't you bring this to me last night?" A pause. I needed to verify it fully before it. Greaves. Another pause. Longer. Because I wasn't sure what you would do with it, Greaves said. Last night, after the announcement, I wasn't sure the information would be received. You thought I would shoot the messenger. I thought, Greaves said very carefully, that the timing was not optimal for a full strategic briefing. Roman looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "You were right. Last night I would have." He stood up. "Get out. Tell the lawyers I need 30 minutes before I come in." Greaves left with the visible relief of someone who had expected a different outcome. Roman stood at the window, 63%. He thought about the 5 years of the marriage, the dinners, the functions. Serafina moving through his empire with her careful movements and her quiet attention, reading things like fire marshal certificates and exit routes. He had thought it was anxiety. He had thought it was the understandable caution of a woman in an environment that was occasionally dangerous. He had not thought it was inventory. He picked up his phone and called Selena. She answered on the second ring. "I heard about the ports. What did you do with the archive files?" he said. A silence. Different from other silences, the specific kind produced by someone who was recalibrating at speed. "I secured them," she said. "Where?" "Somewhere they can be used if necessary." Her voice had a careful quality. "As leverage. If the Vale family goes too far today, we have documentation with Serafina's access credentials that implicates her in the deletion of her own family's evidence," Roman said. "Yes, I understand what it does. What I asked is where." "Roman? Where, Selena?" "My secondary system, the 58th Street apartment." "Go there," he said. "Now, stay there until I contact you." "What are you Go there," he said again and hung up. He stood with the phone in his hand and thought about the structure of what Selena had done. It was tactically competent. She had identified an access vector, exploited it, pulled documents that weakened the Vale family's planned presentation, and secured them in a location she controlled. As a move, in isolation, it was intelligent. The problem was that it had also just told him something about Selena Knox that recontextualized approximately 4 years of information he had been storing in a category labeled loyalty. She had told him about the archive files. She had told him where she had kept the backup. Both of those things, offered with the smooth confidence of someone who believed they were demonstrating initiative and value, had actually demonstrated something else. Selena had kept documentation that could be used as leverage, not against the Vales. The leverage was ambidextrous. It could be used against the Vales to protect Roman, or it could be used against Roman, if the circumstances changed, to protect Selena. She had built herself an exit, in the middle of building his. He put the phone in his pocket and looked at his own reflection in the window glass. The man looking back at him was still very much Roman Dragunov. The building still had his name on it. The lawyers were still down the hall. The empire was contracting, but it was not yet gone. He had approximately 6 hours before 2 o'clock. At 10:45, a black car stopped outside the apartment building on West 58th Street. Serafina had changed into charcoal trousers and a dark jacket, clothing that had been acquired from the East 74th Street guest closet's more professional selections, clothing that fit her well because Cora maintained a guest wardrobe with a specificity that had always in the past seemed excessive and now seemed like prescience. She had not told Octavia exactly what she was doing. She had told Dorian she needed 2 hours and asked for the car and the building address she'd given him. And Dorian, who was very good at operational efficiency and had long since learned that asking his sister follow-up questions produced worse outcomes than trusting her read of a situation, had provided both without additional comment. She went in through the building lobby and took the elevator to the 11th floor and stood in front of apartment 1104 and knocked. A long pause. Then Selena Knox opened the door. She was in silk pajamas and barefoot, and her hair was loose, and the image was so domestically incongruous with the woman Serafina had watched calibrate the touch of her hand against a city official's forearm that it almost produced an involuntary response. Almost. Selena looked at her. Something moved across her face at speed. Not surprise exactly, because Selena Knox had trained herself past the point where surprise showed cleanly, but the rapid recalibration of someone who had expected one thing and was receiving another. Serafina, she said. May I come in? A beat. Yes. The apartment was spare and precisely organized in the way of someone who spent most of their time thinking about contingencies and had applied that thinking to their living space. One painting on the wall, books on a single shelf, arranged with the methodical precision of someone who found disorder cognitively expensive. A desk near the window with a laptop, and beside it an external hard drive connected by a short cable. Serafina looked at the hard drive. Selina looked at Serafina looking at the hard drive. You should sit down, Serafina said. I think, Selina said, that you should tell me what you want. I want the files. I don't know what files. Ahoshul? Selina. Serafina looked at her directly, not with anger. That was the thing, what she felt in this room, standing 4 feet from the woman who had been her husband's affair and her covert adversary, and apparently the person who had spent 5 years gathering intelligence on her family's internal systems, was not primarily anger. It was something colder and more specific. I know about the archive. I know you pulled the records. I know they're on that drive. And I know that whatever you think they're going to do for you today, you're wrong. Selina was very still. The files were going to protect Roman, Selina said. They implicate your credentials in... They implicate my login, Serafina said. Not me. And the deletion timestamp, when forensically examined, will show access patterns inconsistent with how I actually move through digital systems. Our forensic team will have that analysis complete before 2 o'clock. She paused. You're a very good strategic operator, Selina. But you accessed a system you'd only heard described, using credentials you'd had to engineer external authentication for, and you left footprints that don't match the person you were impersonating. Selina's jaw tightened slightly, fractionally, the first visible crack. Give me the drive, Serafina said, and if I don't, then you'll be holding documentation stolen from a major financial institution's private archive, with your fingerprints on the access methodology, when federal investigators who are already being briefed this morning come looking for exactly this kind of material. Serafina tilted her head slightly. Or you give me the drive now, and whatever happens to Roman today happens to Roman, not to you. Selina looked at her for a long time. The apartment was very quiet. Outside the window, the city moved in its perpetual indifference. You know, Selina said slowly, I always thought you were the passive one, the one who let things happen to her. I know. I was watching you for 5 years and I thought, I know what you thought, Serafina said. So did Roman. You were both watching the same performance and drawing the same conclusion. She looked at Selina steadily. The problem is that it was a performance. It just wasn't one I was putting on deliberately. Something shifted in Selina's expression. Deeper than the recalibration. Something that, if it had happened on the face of a person Serafina was less carefully watching, she might have identified as the specific discomfort of someone who has just heard a true thing about themselves, reflected back through someone else's experience. Selina crossed to the desk. She disconnected the hard drive. She held it for a moment. Then she held it out. Serafina took it. What happens to me? Selina said. Not a question, exactly. More the verbal equivalent of a person looking directly at something they had been avoiding. That depends on what you do in the next 3 hours, Serafina said, and on what we find on the rest of this drive. She left the apartment. In the elevator, she looked at the hard drive in her hand and felt, for the first time since she had stood on a sidewalk outside the Whitmore Grand in an ivory dress with a 0 in her banking application, something that was close to, not triumph, nothing that clean, but the bone-deep, slightly exhausted satisfaction of a person who has run a gauntlet and come out the other side holding the thing they went in for. Her phone buzzed. Cash-in. She answered. Where are you? He said. In transit. I have the drive. A pause. You went to Knox's apartment? Yes. Without telling... Cassian. Grandmother. Cassian, she said again, patiently. I have the drive. Have Marcus Veld ready to receive it when I get back. We have 3 hours and 15 minutes. A longer pause. The kind that contained, she knew, a recalibration of certain assumptions her brother had been operating under regarding the version of his sister who had existed before last night. All right, he said. Come straight back. The Hartwell Center's main hall seated 300 and had been arranged by Dorian's team with the particular intentionality of people who understood that the physical architecture of a room determined the psychological architecture of everything that happened inside it. Press seating filled 2/3 of the space. A low platform at the front held a long table, 4 chairs, a podium, and behind it, mounted on a clean white wall, the Vale family crest rendered in simple dark blue. No other decoration, no Dragunov branding, no foundation logos, nothing that suggested this event was affiliated with anything except the family who had called it. Roman arrived at 1:47. He came alone, which was noted by every journalist in the room and which he had calculated carefully, because arriving with security or lawyers would have communicated defensive posture, and Roman Dragunov had not survived 23 years at the top of an empire by communicating defensive posture before a battle began. He wore charcoal. He sat in the press section, 3 rows back from the front, in the seat that provided the clearest sightlines to the platform. People recognized him. Cameras turned, he looked straight ahead. At 2 o'clock exactly, the hall's side door opened. Dorian entered first, then Cassian, then Octavia Vale, who walked to the podium with the bearing of someone who had been entering rooms like this for 50 years and had never once considered the possibility that a room would fail to accommodate her. She arranged nothing. She did not check notes. She looked at the room and said simply, "Thank you for coming." And then Serafina walked in. She had changed, back at East 74th Street, into a deep crimson suit that she had not owned 24 hours ago, and that Cora had somehow produced from wherever Cora produced things, and it bore, on the left lapel, a small enamel pin in the shape of the Vale crest, dark blue on ivory, precise and unambiguous. She walked to the table and sat beside her brothers, and the room, which had been producing the ambient murmur of 300 people pretending not to stare at something, went suddenly very quiet. Roman's jaw tightened. He felt it happen and could not stop it. She looked completely different, not the cosmetic difference of different clothing, something structural like the way she occupied her chair, the angle of her shoulders, the quality of her attention as she looked at the room without looking for anyone specifically, the way she had the night before looked for exits. She looked like someone who had arrived. Octavia began speaking. She was precise and unhurried, and she did not editorialize. She introduced Serafina as the granddaughter and primary heiress of the Vale dynasty. She provided, briefly and without drama, an overview of the family's holdings, the banking interests, the shipping infrastructure, the investment partnerships, the institutional relationships spanning 4 continents and extending back 3 generations. She did it in 6 minutes. The room absorbed it in silence. Then Cassian took the podium and began the financial presentation, and the screens on either side of the platform lit up with the first of the documents: transaction records, institutional stake disclosures, the audit trail assembled over 4 months by Dorian's forensic team, and Roman sat in his seat 3 rows back and watched his empire's internal architecture displayed on a screen in front of 41 media outlets. And the small cold thing from yesterday morning was no longer a thing. It was a temperature. It was the temperature of the room, and the room was getting colder, and he could feel it on his skin with the precision of a man who understood now that the thing he had failed to account for was not the Vale family's financial reach. It was the 5 years of patience it had taken to let him walk all the way to the edge before showing him the drop. Cassian reached the section on the political corruption layer. Roman waited for the gap, the missing records, the absence that should have been there, that Selena's move last night should have created. Cassian did not pause. The transaction records linking the Meridian Fund to the political contribution network appeared on the screen in full. Every record, every timestamp, the complete chain of documentation that Selena had pulled from the archive and that Serafina had retrieved from a hard drive in an apartment on West 58th Street, and that Marcus Veld had processed and reintegrated into the presentation package in 2 hours and 40 minutes of focused, uninterrupted work. Roman looked at the screen. He looked at Serafina. She was looking at the screen with the calm, focused attention of someone reviewing material they are already familiar with. She did not look at him. And Roman Dragunov understood, with the specific and comprehensive clarity of a man who has just watched the last viable move on the board disappear, that there was no version of the next 6 hours that ended with him in control of anything he had believed was his when he woke up yesterday morning. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He already knew, before he looked at it, that it was going to be something he did not want to read. It was a message from Torrance. Federal agents at your office building. Greaves is cooperating. He put the phone back in his pocket. At the podium, Cassian was speaking. The screens were showing numbers. The journalists were writing things down and the cameras were on, and Octavia Vale was sitting very still at the table with her hands folded, watching the room with the unhurried attention of a woman who had designed this architecture years ago and was now simply watching it perform its intended function. Roman sat in his chair in the third row. He was still. He was completely, deliberately still. Because stillness was the last form of control available to him in this room, and Roman Dragunov would maintain the last form of control available to him in any room until the room itself ceased to be his. But Serafina finally turned and looked at him. Then, not with triumph, not with the satisfaction he would have understood and known how to respond to, but with something much harder to receive, which was simple recognition. The look of someone who sees another person clearly, finally, without the intervening distortion of 5 years of careful, patient performance. And Roman felt that look the way he had not felt anything in a very long time. All the way through, with nothing between him and it. He was out of moves, and the worst part, the part he would carry out of this room and would not be able to put down, was that the woman looking at him from that table was not the woman he had dismissed on that sidewalk 36 hours ago. He had made her into something he didn't recognize. He had done that. Roman Dragunov stood up from his seat in the third row. He did it slowly. Deliberately, the way a man stands when he has made a decision that he knows cannot be walked back, and he wants the act of standing to communicate that he understands the weight of what comes next. Every camera in the room swung toward him. Every journalist's hand stilled over their notepad, the ambient hum of the hall compressed into a silence so complete it had physical texture. Cassian stopped speaking. Roman looked at the platform. He looked at Octavia, who looked back at him with the specific quality of attention that contained no surprise whatsoever. He looked at Dorian, who had gone very still in the particular way of someone calculating threat response. He looked at Cassian, who had straightened from the podium but had not stepped back from it. Then he looked at Serafina. She was already looking at him. "I'd like to speak," Roman said. His voice carried without effort. It always did. The room had not been designed for him, and it accommodated him anyway. The way rooms always had, the way spaces bent toward him as a function of how he occupied them. And for a moment, just a moment, the old architecture of his authority asserted itself, and the room held its breath waiting for what came next. Octavia said, "No." One word, flat and final, as a door closing. Something moved across Roman's face. He controlled it quickly, but not quickly enough. The cameras caught it, would replay it in slow motion on broadcast segments for the next 72 hours. The fraction of a second where Roman Dragunov's face registered being told no with the specificity of a man for whom that word had become genuinely foreign. "This is a press event," he said, "not a court proceeding. I have the right to—" "You were extended an invitation to observe," Octavia said. "That was the precise language of the message you received. Observe. You have been observing. You are welcome to continue observing." She looked at him across the 3 rows of press seating with the equanimity of someone who had anticipated this exact moment and had decided well in advance how it would resolve. "Or you are welcome to leave." The room was watching. 400 eyes. 41 media outlets. The cameras on their tripods doing the cold, indifferent work of documentation. Roman stayed standing for 4 more seconds. Serafina counted them. She kept her face neutral and her breathing measured, and she watched Roman Dragunov, who had stood at a podium 36 hours ago and made a calculated public move against her, stand in front of a room full of cameras and understand that the move had been anticipated, answered, and closed, and that every second he remained standing was another second the cameras recorded him standing with nowhere to go. He sat down. The room exhaled. Cassian returned to the podium. Serafina felt her hands, beneath the table where no camera could see them, unclenched from fists she hadn't realized she'd made. The presentation ran for 40 more minutes. Cassian covered the fraudulent property acquisitions. 17 properties across 4 states purchased through shell entities, and used to move cash generated by the port operations. Dorian presented the offshore structure documentation, the Cayman layering system, the Luxembourg gap that had existed in Roman's reported holdings for the last 3 years. The political contribution network appeared on screen as a network diagram, nodes and lines and amounts. The architecture of influence purchased through channels that had been meticulously cleaned before delivery. At 3:17, Cassian said, "We are submitting this documentation package in full to federal investigators at the conclusion of this presentation. We are also providing copies to the international financial agencies with jurisdiction over the offshore structures detailed in sections 4 through 7. A hand went up from the press section, a woman from one of the wire services. "Has law enforcement been briefed prior to today's event?" "Federal contacts were notified this morning," Cassian said. "Our understanding is that investigative action is already underway." Roman's phone was buzzing in his pocket. He could feel it. He did not take it out. Another hand. A broadcast journalist from a major network. "Is Serafina Voil-Dragunov planning to pursue civil action against her husband in addition to the financial evidence submission?" Octavia nodded once toward Serafina. Serafina leaned toward the microphone at the table. She had not spoken yet. The room tightened when she did. Not dramatically, but with the quality of an audience that has been waiting for something without knowing they were waiting for it. "The legal proceedings will take the course they take," she said. "What I can tell you is that no one in my family is interested in prolonging this process. We're interested in it being thorough." She paused. "Those are different things." The wire services journalist followed up. "And your husband? Have you spoken with him?" "He's in the room," Serafina said. "He can hear me." She did not look at Roman when she said it. She looked at the journalist, maintained that let the answer be what it was without editorializing. The room turned toward Roman anyway, the way rooms did, the way the center of gravity in a space will find its contested points automatically. Roman sat in his chair in the third row with his phone buzzing in his pocket and 41 media outlets looking at him, and he produced, from somewhere in the machinery of his self-discipline, an expression that was almost neutral. Almost. At 3:51, the presentation concluded. Cassian thanked the press, announced that the documentation package would be available for download from a secure portal in 30 minutes, indicated that the Vale family would not be taking questions at this time, but that a written statement was being distributed at the exits. The hall began to move, and Roman stood up. He did not move toward the exit. He moved toward the platform, and the 2 Vale security personnel who had been standing at either side of the hall moved simultaneously, and Roman stopped and looked at them, and then looked at the platform and did the calculation. And the calculation told him the same thing it had been telling him for the last 2 hours, which was that he was out of moves, and he did the thing that only the most dangerous cornered animals do when they run out of moves, which was to stop calculating and simply move. "Serafina," he said. She heard her name. She was gathering materials from the table. She stopped. Cassian stepped between them. Not aggressively. He moved with the controlled precision of someone who had positioned himself exactly where he needed to be and wanted that fact to be clear without escalating it. "Mr. Dragunov," Cassian said, "this isn't the venue." "I'm not talking to you," Roman said. "No," Cassian agreed, "but I'm talking to you." Roman looked at him. Cassian was 3 inches shorter and 20 pounds lighter, and had the build of a man who spent his time in boardrooms rather than the environments Roman had spent his time in. And none of that changed the fact that he was standing exactly where he was standing, with exactly the quality of stillness that communicated he would continue standing there indefinitely. Serafina looked up from the table. "It's all right," she said to Cassian. "Sarah, give us 2 minutes." Cassian looked at Roman, then at his sister. He moved 4 steps to the right, close enough to remain relevant, far enough to allow the conversation to happen. The hall was still emptying. The press was moving toward exits, filing notes, already writing. Most of them were not looking at the platform. 2 of them were. The cameras on tripods were still running because camera operators knew that what happened after the official conclusion of an event was frequently more interesting than what happened during it. Roman stopped at the edge of the platform. He looked up at Serafina. The height differential. She was on the platform, he was on the floor, put her physically above him, which was not a dynamic that Roman Dragunov inhabited in any context, and his body registered it with a micro-adjustment, a slight shift in his stance that he controlled immediately. She looked at him from 18 inches away and waited. "You planned this from the beginning," he said. His voice was low. The register of someone who has stopped performing. "The whole marriage, the whole 5 years." "No," she said. "The veil positions inside my institutions go back. My grandmother built those positions," she said, "before I met you. I didn't know about them until 48 hours ago." He looked at her, searching, the gray eyes doing what they did when he was genuinely trying to read something rather than simply projecting authority at it. "I believe you believe that," he said. "I don't need you to believe me," she said. A pause. Roman's jaw moved slightly. "What do you need?" "Right now, for you to walk out of this room and let the process proceed." She held his gaze. "You have lawyers. The evidence is documented. The institutions are already in motion. Fighting it publicly makes it worse for you, not better. Whatever advice your lawyers have been giving you this morning, follow it. Go." And that's all. That's all. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that Cassian shifted slightly in his peripheral, long enough that the 2 cameras still running had enough footage to be significant. "I called you dead weight," Roman said. "Yes. In front of... Yes." Something in his face did something she hadn't seen it do before. Not remorse. She didn't think Roman Dragunov had a reliable access point to remorse, but something adjacent to it. The specific expression of a man who has looked at an error and has been forced, by the magnitude of its consequences, to look at it accurately. "I was wrong," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what this is." He stood there for one more moment. Then he turned and walked toward the exit, and he walked the way he always walked, straight and controlled, and with the bearing of a man who had not been defeated, could not be defeated, would not permit the architecture of his body to communicate defeat, regardless of what the evidence suggested. And the 2 cameras tracked him the whole way. The hall door closed behind him. Cassian appeared at her elbow. "Are you?" "I'm fine," she said. "You don't have to be fine." "I know." She picked up the materials she'd been gathering. "I am, anyway." Roman's phone had received 11 messages during the presentation. He read them in the car. Greaves, confirmed federal agents in the building, asking about Q3 transaction records. His lead lawyer, the Luxembourg structure had been formally flagged by an international financial agency with jurisdiction to freeze associated assets pending review. Torrance. The Marchetti family had released a public statement disavowing any business relationship with Dragunov-affiliated entities. The statement used the word current, which was doing a great deal of work. The last message was from a number he didn't recognize. It contained 3 words. "She has everything." He knew, before he worked out who had sent it, that it referred to Selena. That Selena had given Serafina more than the archive files, had given her something else, something from the secondary system, something that extended beyond the political contribution documentation. He called the number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. The voicemail was generic. He left no message. He called Selena's personal phone. It went directly to voicemail. He called her secondary number, the one reserved for operational communication, the one she never let go to voicemail. Voicemail. He put the phone on the seat beside him and looked out the car window at Manhattan in the mid-afternoon light. Stronger now, the gray morning having burned off into something pale and clear and indifferent, and felt the specific quality of stillness that comes when multiple threat vectors converge simultaneously and the mind, rather than accelerating, goes very quiet in the way of a system conserving resources. Selena had flipped. Not publicly, not yet. But the secondary system, whatever she had on it beyond the archive files, was now in Serafina's possession, and 3 words from an unknown number told him that what it contained was significant, and Selena's phones going dark told him that she had made her decision about which direction to move in before Roman's car had cleared the Hartwell Center's block. He had 4 hours, approximately, before whatever Selena had given Serafina produced its next consequence. "Take me to the office," he said to the driver. "Sir, there are—" "I know," he said. "Take me to the office." The federal agents were in the lobby. 2 of them, in the particular non-uniform of federal investigators. Good suits, conservative ties, the practiced non-expression of people who spent their careers in rooms where everyone was watching everyone else's face and had decided to make their own face as uninformative as possible. They were speaking to the building's head of security, a man named Collins who had worked for Roman for 6 years and who looked, when he saw Roman come through the lobby doors, like a man who wished he was anywhere on earth other than where he was. Roman walked toward the elevator without stopping. One of the agents stepped forward. "Mr. Dragunov." "I'll be available through my counsel," Roman said without slowing. "His number is on file." "Sir, we have through my counsel." He pressed the elevator button. "Collins, call Hargrove and tell him they're here." The elevator opened. He stepped in. The doors closed. He rode to the 44th floor and walked to his office and sat down at his desk and looked at the room that had been his operational center for 11 years. The view was the same. The desk was the same. The bourbon he hadn't opened this morning was still where he'd left it. He opened it. He poured 2 fingers into a glass and left it on the desk and did not drink it. He called his lead lawyer, a man named Hargrove, who had 23 years of experience in the specific intersection of financial crime and organizational law, and who had the quality of someone who had heard everything and who responded to hearing everything with the same measured, calibrated delivery, because he understood that the value of a lawyer in a crisis was not empathy, but clarity. "Tell me where we are," Roman said. Hargrove told him. It took 11 minutes. Roman listened the way he had listened to Greaves that morning, without interruption, taking in the full shape of the information before responding to any part of it. The Luxembourg freeze was confirmed and had triggered a cross-jurisdictional review with exposure to 3 additional structures. The Q3 transaction records. Greaves had pulled for the federal agents were related to the port operations, but would, if examined against the Hartwell documentation package, produce a pattern that no narrative could credibly explain away. 2 of Roman's mid-level operational managers, men who ran the day-to-day logistics of the port infrastructure, had been contacted by federal investigators that afternoon and had, per Hargrove's sources, requested independent counsel within the hour, which was the specific sequence of events that preceded cooperation agreements. "The political contribution network," Roman said, "is fully documented in the package submitted this afternoon," Hargrove said, "including the Meridian Fund linkages. I don't know how they recovered those records." "I do," Roman said. "Then you know that 3 of the 7 political recipients are going to distance themselves by end of business today. I've already received calls from 2 of their offices." Roman looked at the bourbon glass. "What can you do?" A pause, the kind that contained a man choosing how to frame an answer that had limited positive options. "At this stage, Roman, the most valuable thing we can do is control the narrative of your cooperation rather than your resistance. If we move proactively, if we engage with the investigators before they compel us to, we have some degree of agency over how this proceeding is characterized. You're telling me to cooperate. I'm telling you that cooperation is the only remaining lever you have." Roman looked at the bourbon glass for a long time. "I'll call you back," he said. He hung up. He sat in the chair that had been his for 11 years and looked at the 44th floor view of Manhattan that had also been his for 11 years. And he thought about the sequence of the last 48 hours with the clarity of a man who has no remaining investment in a particular outcome and can therefore see the shape of events without the distortion of hope. He had made the move at the gala because Selena had said it was time, and because he had believed the move was clean, that Serafina was sufficiently isolated, sufficiently emptied of the connections and resources that would have made her dangerous, that the severance could be executed without significant consequence. He had believed this because 5 years of watching her not exercise her power had convinced him the power was gone. He had not understood that not exercising power is itself a form of power. He had not understood that the woman who stood quietly in his spaces and read fire marshal certificates was not diminished by her quiet. She was waiting inside it. His desk phone rang. The internal line again. He looked at it, picked it up. "Sir?" "Collins." His voice had the quality of someone delivering information they have rehearsed to get through cleanly. "There are additional federal agents in the lobby, and a representative from the International Financial Agency is asking to speak with your legal team regarding the Luxembourg matter." A pause. "Also, sir, the building's name." "What about the building's name?" The exterior signage company received a communication this afternoon regarding the... They said they received instruction to begin removal of the exterior lettering. The instruction came through a property management entity that apparently holds a subsidiary stake in the building's operating company. Another pause. I don't know how to... It's all right, Collins, Roman said. He was surprised distantly to find that he meant it. Tell the agents I'll have my lawyer contact them within the hour. He hung up. He looked at the bourbon, picked it up, set it down again without drinking. Outside on the 44th floor of a building that had his name on the outside, for now, Manhattan continued its indifferent, relentless function. Below, federal agents were in the lobby. Somewhere across the city, Selena Knox was in a room with people she had decided were better positioned than Roman to determine her next chapter. In a townhouse on East 74th Street, Serafina Vale was sitting with her grandmother and her brothers and the documentation from Selena's secondary drive. And whatever was on that drive was about to produce consequences that Roman's lawyer would be characterizing as cooperation opportunities within the next 24 hours. He had one move left, not a winning move. He understood that completely. There were no winning moves remaining on this board. But there was a move that was better than the alternative, better than being pulled into a proceeding where his resistance became the defining narrative, where his refusal to engage became the image that every outlet ran for the next 18 months. He reached for his phone. He called Hargrove back. All right, he said, when Hargrove answered. Tell me how cooperation works, Hargrove told him. At 6:43 p.m., in a conference room on the 17th floor of a federal building 4 blocks from Dragunov Tower, Serafina received a call from Dorian. She stepped out of the room where she and Cassian and Octavia and 2 federal liaisons had been reviewing the secondary drive documentation, which contained, among other materials, a set of voice recordings Selena Knox had made over the course of 4 years. Recordings of operational conversations that she had collected with the methodical foresight of a woman who had always understood that the man she was working beside was also the man she was most at risk from. The recordings were comprehensive. The recordings were, as the federal liaison who had been reviewing them for the last 90 minutes put it with the flat restraint of someone trained not to editorialize, extremely useful. Serafina stepped into the corridor and answered Dorian's call. Roman's lawyer called the federal line 20 minutes ago, Dorian said. He's initiating a cooperation conversation. She stood in the corridor with the phone at her ear. The fluorescent light was the particular institutional quality of government building lighting, flat and honest and completely uninterested in making anyone look good. All right, she said. That's all? All right? What else should it be? A pause on Dorian's end. I thought you might want to, I don't know, mark the moment somehow. She thought about it. Thought about the corridor, the lighting, the conference room full of documentation, the federal liaison with his flat, restrained delivery, the ivory dress she'd worn 2 nights ago that was currently hanging in a guest room on East 74th Street and that she had not decided yet what to do with. The moment's already marked, she said. I'll be back in 5 minutes. She hung up. She stood in the corridor for those 5 minutes and breathed with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been managing their breathing for 48 hours and who is beginning to understand that they are going to need to do this for a while longer yet, because the next phase was not resolution, it was process. And process was long and unglamorous and required the specific endurance of someone who had learned, in 5 years of very deliberate waiting, that sustaining something quietly was harder and more valuable than any single dramatic act. She breathed. She went back into the room. At 7:15, a federal warrant was issued for the seizure of Dragunov Tower and 17 associated properties as part of a coordinated asset freeze tied to the financial crime investigation. The warrant covered the penthouse. At 7:22, Selena Knox arrived at the federal building on her own, with her own lawyer, and requested to give a voluntary statement. At 7:40, Serafina stepped out of the conference room for the second time and found Octavia Vale standing in the corridor, hands folded, looking at nothing in particular with the equanimity of a woman who had spent her entire adult life doing exactly this, standing in corridors outside rooms where consequential things were happening and remaining, against all the pressure that corridors outside consequential rooms produce, entirely composed. Grandmother, Serafina said. Octavia looked at her. Is it over? Serafina asked. Octavia considered this with the seriousness it deserved. The acute phase, she said. The rest will take time. How much time? Months, possibly longer. She looked at Serafina with the direct, unsentimental attention she brought to everything. Are you asking whether it's safe to stop bracing? Serafina thought about it honestly. Yes. Not yet, Octavia said, but soon. Serafina leaned against the corridor wall. The institutional lighting did what it did. Down the hall, somewhere behind a closed door, Selena Knox was telling a federal investigator everything she had recorded over 4 years of sitting beside a man she had decided was more useful as a liability than a partner. I need to ask you something, Serafina said. Octavia waited. The positions inside his institutions, the architecture you built. You built it before I met him. Yes, which means you knew when I told you about him. When I first called you and told you I was serious about Roman Dragunov, what you already had in place. Yes. Did you try to warn me? Octavia was quiet for a moment, not evasive. Octavia Vale was constitutionally incapable of evasion. It was simply not a mode she had ever found useful, but present with the question, sitting with it, giving it the accuracy it deserved. I told you he was dangerous, she said. You said you knew. I said I knew, Serafina said. I didn't know. No, Octavia said. You didn't. And you let me go anyway. You were 31 years old, Octavia said. You were not someone who could be let or not let. You made your decision. I respected it. A pause. And I built the contingency. Serafina looked at her grandmother. At the midnight blue, the silver hair, the hands folded with the stillness of someone who has spent a lifetime making decisions that other people lived inside without knowing. You built a 5-year contingency, Serafina said. I built a permanent contingency, Octavia said simply. Because you are my granddaughter, and permanent is the only kind I build. The corridor held them both for a moment. The older woman and the younger, the architecture of the family between them, like something load-bearing, like the old stone of the East 74th Street townhouse that smelled like paper and wool, and the specific quality of safety that came not from softness, but from permanence. Then Serafina's phone buzzed. She looked at it, a message from the federal liaison inside the conference room. Knox's statement is producing additional warrant-eligible material. We're going to need you back in. She showed the screen to Octavia. Octavia looked at it and said, Go. Serafina pushed off the wall and moved back toward the conference room door and put her hand on the handle and stopped for one moment with her back to the corridor, feeling the weight of the handle, the resistance of it, the specific physical reality of a door that was about to open into the next phase of something that was going to take months and that was going to require everything she had discovered she possessed in the last 48 hours, and more besides. She pushed it open. The federal building's conference room smelled like recycled air and old coffee, and the specific institutional exhaustion of a space that had absorbed too many difficult conversations to hold any particular one of them anymore. Serafina sat at the table for 4 more hours after she pushed that door open. The federal liaison, a man named Carruthers, who had the built-in patience of someone who had chosen a profession that required sitting in rooms like this for long stretches and had made his peace with that years ago, walked her and Cassian through the additional material Selena's statement had produced. Voice recordings, primarily. 4 years of them. Selena had been meticulous in her documentation, which Serafina supposed she should not have found surprising, but did anyway, slightly. Not the existence of the recordings, but the scope of them, the comprehensiveness, the picture they assembled of a woman who had spent 4 years building a parallel record of everything she participated in as insurance against the day the man she was building it with became the primary threat to her continued existence. That day had arrived. The recordings covered port operations, political payments, the offshore layering system, 3 specific property transactions that Hargrove had apparently not known about because Roman had run them through a structure that bypassed his primary legal team entirely, and a conversation from 14 months ago in which Roman had discussed, with 2 men whose names appeared in the warrant materials, the question of what to do about a shipping broker in Rotterdam, who had become, in Roman's word, inconvenient. The Rotterdam broker was alive. He had simply relocated under circumstances that remained unclear. The conversation was enough. Carruthers said, with his flat delivery, that this was very useful. Serafina said she was glad. She meant it, and she didn't, simultaneously, because the recordings were the machinery of consequence doing its work, and she understood their value precisely, and also found, sitting in that room at 11 o'clock at night with fluorescent lighting and recycled air and the residue of 400 cups of old coffee, that consequence was exhausting in a way she hadn't anticipated. Not the achieving of it, the weight of it. She had believed on some level she hadn't examined directly, that when the machinery was fully in motion, she would feel something clean, some resolution with a definable edge. Instead, what she felt was the specific tiredness of someone who has been running on urgency and has now arrived at the point where urgency is no longer the operative fuel and the body is presenting its invoice. Cassian drove her back to East 74th Street at 11:47. They didn't speak much in the car. He asked once if she was hungry. She said no. He said she should eat anyway. She said she knew. He didn't push it, which was the right call, and she appreciated it in the wordless way of people who are too tired for explicit appreciation. Octavia was asleep when they arrived. Cora had left food in the kitchen, something warm in a covered pot, bread on the counter, and Serafina sat at the kitchen table in the specific silence of a house at midnight and ate because Cassian was right, and because her body needed fuel, regardless of whether she felt its absence. Cassian sat across from her and drank water and didn't talk, which was its own form of company. "The recordings," she said eventually. He looked up. "She made them for herself," Serafina said. "Not for us. She made them because she already knew 4 years ago that she was building her own cage next to his." "Yes," Cassian said. "She's not going to be all right." "No," he agreed. "Probably not." Serafina thought about Selena Knox in her spare apartment with its single painting and its methodically arranged books, making recordings of conversations and keeping external hard drives and performing, every day for 4 years, the same kind of careful, strategic patience that Serafina had performed inside Roman's empire. Except that Selena's version was powered by ambition and fear simultaneously, which was a harder engine to run, and it had brought her to a federal building giving a voluntary statement that would probably keep her out of a maximum security facility, but would not keep her out of a courtroom or a conviction. 2 women, Serafina thought, in the same orbit, performing different versions of the same survival. She didn't say that to Cassian. She filed it in the category of things she would sit with later, when later arrived. She went to bed at midnight and slept for 9 hours without interruption, which was either the sign of a conscience at peace or a body that had simply hit its limit and overridden everything else. She chose not to investigate which. The next 6 months were not clean. She had known they wouldn't be when Octavia said months, possibly longer, and she had nodded and filed that information correctly, not as warning, but as operational reality. She had filed it, and she had lived inside it, and living inside it was a different thing than filing it. The civil proceedings moved on a timeline that had its own internal logic and did not accommodate urgency, regardless of how urgently the parties involved felt about their particular corners of it. The federal investigation produced indictments on a schedule that Hargrove and the opposing legal teams negotiated across conference tables that all looked, Serafina suspected, exactly like the conference room in the federal building where she had sat until midnight absorbing Selena Knox's 4 years of insurance recordings. Roman's cooperation agreement was finalized in the 3rd week. He provided testimony on the political contribution network, on 3 of the offshore structures, and on the Rotterdam situation, which became its own subsidiary investigation. In exchange, certain charges were reduced and a cooperation credit was applied. The outcome was not freedom. It was a structured accountability, a proceeding with a defined arc, which was the most a lawyer of Hargrove's caliber could produce from the materials available. Serafina did not attend any of the sessions where Roman testified. She received summaries from Dorian, who read them with the efficiency of someone processing operational intelligence, and she read the summaries and set them aside and got on with the day's work. Because the day's work was considerable and was, she was discovering, the most effective available counter to the particular gravitational pull of spending too much time in the orbit of what had already happened. The day's work was the Veil Restoration Foundation. The idea had existed, embryonically, before the marriage. She had mentioned it to Octavia once, years ago, during a visit she barely remembered now except for the quality of her grandmother's response, which had been a single question: what kind of restoration? She had not known how to answer that then. She knew now. The foundation was established in the fourth month. Its mandate was specific: cultural preservation, community restoration, support for artists whose work was significant and whose circumstances were not. The structural work, the legal architecture, the endowment, the board composition, was Cassian's domain, and he brought to it the same meticulous precision he brought to everything, which meant it was built correctly the first time and did not require the ongoing maintenance of structures that had been assembled hastily. Serafina ran the operational side. This surprised people who had known her as Roman's wife, the quiet, careful woman who moved through his spaces with a water glass and a practiced smile. The surprise was something she encountered frequently in the first months, in meetings with cultural organizations and municipal arts bodies and community representatives who arrived at the table with a prepared version of who they expected to find and had to revise it in real time. She didn't explain herself. Explanation felt like the wrong use of the energy. She simply worked, and the work communicated what it communicated, and people revised their expectations accordingly. Dorian handled the financial crimes proceedings documentation requirements, which were extensive. 3 separate regulatory bodies required different submission formats for overlapping sets of the same materials, and coordinating those submissions while managing the civil divorce proceedings, and the Foundation's establishment simultaneously required the kind of organizational capacity that Dorian Vale had been building for his entire professional life, and deployed now with the focused satisfaction of someone whose particular skill set had found exactly the right application. Octavia supervised everything, not visibly. She was not present at Foundation board meetings or in regulatory submission discussions. She was present in the way she was always present, in a wingback chair near a fire, reading a tablet, available for the questions that required a different category of answer than the ones Cassian or Dorian or the lawyers could provide. The questions about what something meant rather than what it did, about the longer arc rather than the immediate step. Serafina asked those questions more than she had expected to. The divorce was finalized in the 5th month. The legal document was 8 pages of structured language that reduced 5 years of a marriage to define terms and executed severances and the specific vocabulary of an agreement between parties who no longer disputed the relevant facts and were principally concerned with ensuring that the resolution was thorough. Serafina signed it at Hargrove's office, not Roman's Hargrove, her own lawyer, a woman named Bryce, who had the quality of someone who had built her entire practice on helping people exit complicated situations, and who brought to that work a combination of precision and humanity that Serafina found, in the circumstances, genuinely valuable. She signed it, and Bryce offered her water, and she accepted it and drank it and thought about a different water glass in a different room 4 months ago, and the distance between those 2 glasses felt both enormous and surprisingly close. She did not cry when she signed it. She had cried twice during the 6 months. Once, in the 2nd week, alone in the bathroom of the East 74th Street townhouse at 3 in the morning when the accumulated weight of everything arrived simultaneously and could not be managed by breathing or work or the company of her brothers or any of the other mechanisms she had deployed. She had sat on the bathroom floor and cried for 20 minutes with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that the crying was necessary and that it needed to happen completely, rather than being distributed across many smaller moments that would collectively take longer and leave more residue. The second time was at a meeting with a community arts organization in the Bronx, in the 6th week, when the organization's director, a woman in her 60s who had run the program for 23 years through funding cycles that had nearly killed it twice, described what consistent, secure funding would mean for the families who depended on their programming. She described one family specifically. A grandmother and 3 grandchildren and a 7-year-old who painted with such intensity that the art teacher had taken photographs to show the director because she needed someone else to see it. Serafina had excused herself briefly. She had stood in the hallway outside the meeting room and pressed her back against the wall and breathed, and what came out of her eyes was not grief and not relief, and not anything she had a clean name for. It was something that lived below names, that had to do with the specific intersection of what she had come from and what she had chosen, and what the 7-year-old's intensity with paint meant in the context of all of it. She went back in after 3 minutes. She approved the funding before the meeting ended. Selena Knox's trial was set for the 7th month. She had cooperated extensively, and her legal team had assembled a mitigation case that was, by all accounts, competent. The cooperation credit would reduce the sentence significantly. She would not avoid conviction. She had not attempted to. She had made her calculation in the hallway of the federal building, and she was living inside it, which was, Serafina thought when she read Dorian's summary, the most honest thing Selena had done in the entire 5 years of Serafina's acquaintance with her. She did not attend the trial. She sent nothing, no message, no communication of any kind. There was nothing to send that would have been appropriate or true. The only true thing she could have communicated to Selena Knox was that she understood the mechanics of surviving inside a dangerous man's orbit, and that she bore Selena no specific personal malice, and that seemed like the kind of thing better left unsaid than said badly. Roman's sentencing came in the 6th month. The cooperation credit, combined with Hargrove's advocacy and the quality of his testimony on the political network, produced a result that the press described as lenient, and that Serafina, reading the coverage on a Tuesday morning in the Foundation's new offices in a building near the East River, thought was probably accurate in the specific sense that leniency and consequence are not mutually exclusive, and Roman Dragunov was going to live inside consequence for a defined period, regardless of what the headline called it. He would not be free for 3 years. The penthouse, the glass box where she had spent 5 years learning to move carefully and read exit routes, had been seized in the asset freeze and was being processed through the bankruptcy proceedings that the Veiled Dynasty's legal team had initiated following the Hartwell presentation. It would eventually be sold. The proceeds would be distributed among the creditors of the various shell entities that had used it as collateral for structures that had now been fully unwound. She did not think about the penthouse often. When she did, she thought about the fire marshal's certificate near the service entrance, the number of people the space could hold, the distance to the nearest door. She thought about those things with the specific detachment of someone who had processed a room so completely that it no longer held weight. The unfinished skyscraper, the one Roman had announced at the gala as the future headquarters of his legitimate global enterprise, was purchased by the Veiled Dynasty in the 5th month through a subsidiary established for the purpose. The acquisition price was below market because the asset was distressed, and the seller was a bankruptcy proceeding with limited negotiating leverage. Cassian handled the transaction with his usual efficiency. The plans for what it would become took longer to determine than the purchase itself. Serafina proposed it in the 6th month in a meeting with Octavia and Cassian and Dorian and the Foundation's newly appointed program director. She proposed it without preamble, simply stated it. The building should become the Foundation's primary international hub: cultural programming, preservation resources, artist residencies, community partnerships. A center for the kind of work the Foundation was doing, scaled up to occupy a structure that had been intended for a very different purpose and that would now, over the course of the years it would take to complete the renovation, become something that had no connection to what it had originally been, except the physical bones of it, which were good bones, which was all bones needed to be. Cassian asked about the timeline. She said 3 years minimum. He said that was realistic. Octavia said nothing, which was her way of agreeing completely. The Foundation's inaugural gala was held in Florence in the 8th month. The choice of Florence had been Serafina's, not for any symbolic reason she could have articulated cleanly, but because Florence had the quality of a city that understood restoration as a practice rather than an event, that had built an entire relationship with time around the premise that things worth preserving required patient, skilled, ongoing effort, and that the effort itself was the point, rather than merely the means to an end. The gala was held in a hall with 16th century ceilings and modern lighting and 200 guests who included historians and cultural preservation specialists and municipal arts officials and philanthropists from 11 countries, and a small but significant contingent of community organization leaders who had been specifically flown in because Serafina had insisted that the people who represented the Foundation's actual work should be present at its public launch, rather than learned about it from a program booklet. She spoke for 12 minutes. She had written the remarks herself, over 3 evenings, in her room at the hotel with a notepad and a pen, because she found that words arrived differently by hand than by keyboard, slower, more considered, more inclined to locate the specific true thing rather than the near true thing that arrived faster. She rewrote the opening 3 times. The other sections she left largely as first written, because first written was frequently where the honest version lived, and revision was sometimes just the mind's attempt to make honest things more comfortable. She told the audience that the Foundation's work was not about grand gestures. that the things worth preserving were rarely the things that announced themselves loudly, that the work of restoration, cultural, personal, communal, was incremental and unglamorous, and required the willingness to be present for the long duration rather than the singular dramatic moment. She said that the greatest misunderstanding about strength was that it was loud, that the quietest version of strength was frequently the one with the deepest roots. She did not mention Roman. She did not mention the gala in New York, or the ivory dress, or the walk across a lobby with Victor's eyes on the floor. The remarks did not require those things. The people who knew the context heard the remarks through it. The people who didn't know the context heard the remarks on their own terms. Both versions were accurate. When she finished, the room applauded with the quality of an audience that had been genuinely reached rather than merely impressed. And she stood at the podium and received it and felt, for the first time in 8 months, something that was not urgency or exhaustion or the disciplined management of accumulated difficulty. It was quieter than any of those. She had met Matteo Bellini the previous afternoon in the hall itself, while the foundation team was completing setup. He was the art conservator the venue's cultural director had recommended for an assessment of 2 17th-century panels that required professional evaluation before they could be safely moved for the event. He had arrived with a kit of tools and a portable light and a quality of focused attention that Serafina had noticed before she noticed him specifically. The attention first, the person second, which was an ordering of things she associated with people who were genuinely interested in the work they were doing rather than the impression the work created. He was 44, quiet without being withdrawn, and when the venue's cultural director introduced them and explained that Serafina was the foundation's director, he had looked at her with the direct, unhurried interest of someone asking a real question and said, "What drew you to preservation specifically?" Not congratulations. Not the social scaffolding of an initial meeting, just the question. She had said, without thinking about it, "I think I've spent a long time in spaces that needed it." He had looked at her for a moment and then nodded in the way of someone who recognizes a true answer and doesn't feel the need to do anything additional with it. They had talked for 40 minutes while his assessment of the panels proceeded in parallel, him moving between the conversation and the work with the ease of someone for whom both were natural modes. He told her about a restoration project in Siena that had taken 6 years and had produced in the final phase a discovery about the original painter's technique that had rewritten the prevailing academic understanding of a 40-year period in the artist's career. He told it without grandiosity, as a story about patience and what patience occasionally produced, told by someone who had been inside the patience rather than observing it. She had listened the way she had been learning to listen, fully, without the concurrent calculation of what came next. The way she had once listened to Roman with one part of her attention always monitoring the exits. There were no exits she needed to monitor here. She had thought about that on her way back to the hotel, about what it felt like to be in a room and not need to know where the exits were, about how long it had been since that had been true, about the fact that it was true now, in Florence, in a hall with 16th-century ceilings, and a conservator who asked real questions and told stories about 6-year projects with genuine plainness. She didn't know what that meant yet, in terms of what came next. She had learned in 8 months to be cautious about the category of what comes next, to let things be what they were before asking what they would become. That was the practice. It was harder than it sounded, and she was still inside the learning of it. At the gala's conclusion, she found Matteo Bellini near the back of the hall, where he was looking at one of the panels with the particular focused stillness of someone who couldn't quite turn off the professional attention, even in a social context. "The restoration work," she said, "for the new building in New York. We'll need a conservation team for the permanent collection, if you know anyone." He looked at her with the same direct, unhurried interest as the previous afternoon. "I might know someone," he said. "I thought you might," she said. He smiled. It was a plain, unhurried smile, the kind produced by someone who had not practiced it and didn't need to. She didn't promise anything. Neither did he. The conversation ended the way honest conversations end, not with a neat conclusion, but with the sense that something had been accurately said and did not need to be added to immediately. Across the room, Octavia Vale stood near the tall windows that looked out over the Florence night, the city's lights doing what city lights did, making the dark look like something deliberate rather than merely the absence of day. She had a glass of wine she had barely touched, and she was watching her granddaughter with the specific quality of attention she brought to things she considered worth watching. She watched Serafina move through the room after the conservator walked away, not with the careful, monitored movement of the woman who had read fire marshal certificates in Roman Dragunov's penthouse, but with the ease of someone who had fully arrived in the space they were in, unhurried, present, not performing anything. Dorian appeared at Octavia's shoulder. He had a glass of water and the expression of someone who had completed the evening's operational requirements and was now permitting himself a moment of something adjacent to relaxation. "She's good," he said. "Yes," Octavia said. "Better than before." "Better than before," Octavia agreed. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the room. "Roman's sentencing is next week," Dorian said. "I know." "She won't attend." "No," Octavia said. "She won't." Another silence. "Do you think she's past it?" Dorian said. "The marriage. All of it." Octavia considered this with the seriousness she brought to questions that deserved it. "She's past the part where it determines what she does next," she said finally. "The rest takes longer." Dorian nodded. He had learned over 40 years of being Octavia Vale's grandson that her formulations on this kind of question were worth taking at face value rather than interrogating. Across the room, Serafina accepted a glass of water from a passing server. Sparkling water, it looked like, in a tall glass, and turned to speak with the director of a community arts program from Lagos, who had flown 14 hours to be here, and whose organization was one of the foundation's first international partners, and whose programs served in a neighborhood that the city's development plans had treated as peripheral for 2 decades, over 300 children a year. She looked genuinely delighted to be talking to him. That was the thing Octavia noticed most clearly. Not the composure, not the capability, not the evident operational competence that had grown visibly across 8 months of considerable pressure. Those things were real, and she noted them. But the thing she watched most carefully was simpler and more difficult to manufacture. Serafina Vale looked genuinely delighted to be exactly where she was. That was not something that could be performed. That was something that happened when a person had traveled far enough from the space where delight was not available to them that they had stopped taking its return for granted. The gala wound down, the way good evenings wound down. Gradually, without a clean ending, guests departing in clusters with the specific reluctance of people who have been in a room where the quality of conversation exceeded their expectations and are not quite ready to return to the ordinary volume of their lives. Serafina stayed until the last guests had gone. Then she stood in the emptying hall with the foundation team while they completed the breakdown, and she helped where she could, which was not much. She was not a person who knew how to fold event linens efficiently, a skill she had apparently failed to acquire at any point in her life, and laughed at herself when the event manager kindly suggested she leave the linens to the people who had experience with the linens. She walked back to the hotel through Florence at midnight, with Dorian beside her and Cassian slightly ahead, and Octavia in a car that she had arranged for herself at 9 p.m., because Octavia Vale had also apparently made her peace with the thing she was and was not suited for at 76. The streets were cobblestone and lit, and the city at midnight had the specific quality that old cities have, the weight of everything that had happened in them, the accumulated human record of centuries sitting lightly in the stones, and the light, and the way the night air moved through spaces that had been standing long enough to have forgotten the specific events they had witnessed and retained only their general quality. Serafina walked and felt the cobblestones under her feet, and the night air on her face, and the particular cleanness of an evening that had been what it was supposed to be. She thought about the ivory dress. It was still in the guest room on East 74th Street. She had not decided what to do with it. She thought now, walking the cobblestones in Florence, that she probably didn't need to decide. Some things didn't require decisions. Some things could simply be allowed to be what they were. Objects in a room, evidence of a specific period of a life, neither preserved nor destroyed, but simply present in the way that the past is always present, as something you have moved beyond rather than something that has ceased to exist. She thought about the fire marshal certificate, the number of people the space could hold, 412. She thought about the Bronx Arts Organization's 7-year-old who painted with intensity. She thought about the 6-year restoration project in Siena and what it had revealed about a painter's technique. She thought about Matteo Bellini's plain, unhurried smile and the question he had asked, "What drew you to preservation specifically?" And her answer? I think I've spent a long time in spaces that needed it. The answer was still true. She walked through Florence at midnight, and she was 36 years old, and she had spent 5 years in a space that needed preservation and had not known, for most of those 5 years, that the thing most in need of preserving was herself. She knew it now. The knowing had cost something significant and had produced something she didn't have a clean name for yet. Not wisdom, which was a word she distrusted for its tendency to make hard experience sound cleaner than it was, but something in that direction. Something earned. Dorian said beside her, "Good night." She looked at him. He was looking at the street ahead, which was his way of looking at things. Not directly, but accurately. "Yes," she said. "The gala." "The gala," she agreed. "Yes." He nodded. They walked. Cassian, ahead, turned briefly to check their position and then turned back without speaking, which was his way of checking on people. The quick look, the confirmation that they were present, the turning back. She was present. She was entirely, completely present, in a way that she had not been for a long time. The way you are present when you are not simultaneously monitoring exits, when you are not performing quiet, when you are not managing the temperature of a room whose temperature is someone else's to control. She was present in the way that belonged only to herself. In this street, in this city, in this specific moment after a good evening's work, with the stones under her feet and the night air on her face and everything ahead of her still to be determined and the past exactly where it belonged, which was behind her. Roman Dragunov would spend the next 3 years inside a federal correctional facility in New Jersey. He would read extensively. He had always been a man who consumed information efficiently, and he applied that quality to the books available to him with the methodical discipline of someone converting time into something productive, regardless of circumstances. He would not, in those 3 years, contact Serafina. He had said what he was going to say in the Hartwell Center, and she had given him exactly what the situation called for, which was nothing more than an accurate account of consequences. And there was nothing else between them that required words. The Dragunov name would disappear from the exterior of the tower on the 44th floor by the end of the year. The building would be sold to a real estate investment group with no connection to organized crime and would be renovated and rebranded and would absorb over the following years the ordinary history of a Manhattan office building without any of the specific history of what it had been before. Selena Knox would serve 22 months before her release. She would not return to New York. The specific details of where she went and what she did there were not something Serafina learned, because Serafina did not seek them out, and the people who might have told her understood, without being asked, that this was information she had no use for. Octavia Vale, at 76, remained exactly what she had always been. The permanent contingency, the architect of structures designed to outlast the events they were built to address. She would attend the Foundation's second annual gala the following year in Lisbon, wearing midnight blue, folding her hands in that particular way, watching the room with the unhurried attention of someone who considers watching carefully to be one of the primary forms of love. Cassian would manage the new building's financial structure for 3 years before the renovation was complete. He would bring to that project the same precision he brought to everything, and the building would open on time and within budget, which were outcomes that Cassian Vale produced not by luck, but by the specific application of intelligence to detail over sustained periods of time. Dorian would move in the second year to establish the Foundation's European operational office in Florence. This was a practical decision. The Foundation's European partnerships were concentrated there, and physical presence reduced coordination friction. It was also, though he did not say this, a decision that had something to do with the quality of the city itself, with what a place felt like when you were inside it and doing work that mattered in it. And Serafina Vale would spend the next years building the thing she had named without knowing she was naming it in a hallway outside a conference room at 3 in the morning, something that endured. The Foundation's work was incremental and unglamorous and required presence for the long duration, and she was there for it. In Bronx meeting rooms and Lagos partnership reviews and Siena consultation visits and the ongoing slow renovation of a Manhattan building that was becoming, stone by stone and floor by floor, something entirely different from what it had been. The conservator from Florence became, over the following year and a half, a consistent presence in those spaces. Professionally at first, then in the way that consistent presence in shared work becomes, when the work is real and the people are honest and neither is performing anything for the other. It was not a dramatic development. It had the quality of things that grow slowly in conditions that are simply right for growing. No single moment of arrival, just the accumulative evidence of something becoming what it was. She did not know, standing in the Florence Hall at midnight watching the event staff fold the linen she had failed to fold competently, what that would become. She knew it was honest. For now, that was the thing that mattered. She walked back to the hotel through the cobblestone streets and the night air and the accumulated weight of a city that had been standing long enough to know that most things, given sufficient time and honest effort, could be restored to something worth keeping. She walked and she was present and she was herself. And that, after everything, was enough.